ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
How do you feel? Excited and nervous at the same time.
Births, deaths, marriages. There are big days in life you'll likely remember forever.
We were so shocked.
Not always for the right reasons.
People can be so uncaring in an industry which requires the utmost empathy.
When emotions run high, it's easy to drop your guard.
An ultimate act of betrayal.
Births, deaths and marriages on Background Briefing. Hear it now on the ABC Listen app.
With summer upon us, cranking up the air conditioning is the most comfortable option. But the electricity bill that goes with it can be, well, rude. That's probably why more Australians than ever now have solar panels. But while that sounds pretty good, there is a problem because, yes, there is a thing as too much solar. Today, energy reporter Dan Mercer explains why. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Dan, it's getting really hot now, of course, because summer is here and we know in Australia there is going to be a heap of sunshine, which is really good news if you have solar panels on your roof. And oh my, there are so many people that actually have that now, aren't there?
Yeah, it's a remarkable number of people, Sam. By the federal government's estimates, a couple of weeks ago we had our 4 millionth rooftop solar installation, which is a big number in a country like Australia, and certainly a bunch of them are on small businesses and commercial buildings. But any way you dice it, there's just no doubt that Australia has an extraordinary amount of solar on rooftops. Yeah. And when you think that just 20 years ago there were barely any panels anywhere, it's incredible.
That's brilliant, isn't it? And it's really providing relief for people on their bills because, of course, if you don't have it, the electricity bill, the power bills, they can come as a pretty big shock most of the time.
Yeah, I think in the main that's right. The rule of thumb is that solar will cut your bills these days by about 30-odd%. Mm-hmm. There's probably still a perception, I reckon, in some circles that you can somehow win by selling the surplus solar back to the grid. But the reality is there's now so much solar being generated in the middle of the day across Australia that the output is valued at close to zero by the market. So using the power yourself is really the ticket, and it sure beats buying the electricity from the grid. I spoke to one Sydney householder, Kerry Bradbury.
I live in Chifley, New South Wales, and I work for the New South Wales Health.
She was getting stung by very high bills until recently, like many Australians have been.
And it got to the stage where you're actually afraid to open your electricity bill, because in those days it came in the mail.
She's got 3 kids. I think they're all adults. And they don't strictly live at home with her, but they are occasional tenants.
Oh, yes, those.
Yeah.
And also having 3 transient children, for want of a better word, coming in and out. I've had huge bills when they're here and not so huge bills when they're not here, when it's just me.
And when they are there, or certainly until recently when they were there, she said she was getting bills of up to $2,000 a quarter.
Wow.
So she decided to take matters into her own hands.
So she's basically, set herself up to use solar as much as she possibly can. So just tell me what she's got.
She shelled out for a system that could basically take care of all her power needs. She installed batteries, she got new solar panels, she bought smart appliances and invested in some tech that could coordinate all of this for her. It's a smaller power provider that runs it all for her. And it wasn't cheap. It cost her about $28,000,
Wow.
Not the sort of money that the average person necessarily would have lying around.
No.
But she says she now won't have to pay a power bill for the next 7 years.
It is quite expensive, but you have to weigh up the cost, A, to the environment, if you can afford it, and how big your actual bills are. If you're getting hammered every time, you've got to look at other solutions.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. But then what happens after the 7 years? Because 28,000, as you say, that's a pretty big number.
Yeah. I mean, to a large extent, it'll depend on her circumstances after 7 years. But she might not have to pay any bills for a few more years after that. She might, on the other hand, have to replace the batteries because batteries do degrade. That's just a reality with them. But even then, batteries are likely to be much cheaper by then, Sam.
Yeah.
That's certainly the forecasts.
All right. Well, Dan, Kerry, of course, was sick of her massive power bill. So she's done what lots of Australians have done and has tried to take advantage of the sun. And, of course, we expect that number to keep growing. But things can get tricky because there is such a thing as too much solar.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes a problem when solar supply eclipses demand for power from the grid.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got no way of using that excess generation or storing it somewhere. And realistically, we are reaching that point in Australia at times. It's made worse, or it's really kind of characterised by a technical phenomenon known as minimum demand.
Mm-hmm.
Now, energy nerds, and that's not the vast majority of Australians.
That's you though, Dan, right?
Well, perhaps that's an uncharitable interpretation, Sam.
It's a compliment. It's a compliment.
But yeah, I mean, they have been talking and warning about this phenomenon for years. But it basically refers to demand for electricity from the grid. Yeah, that's key. And, therefore it excludes demand for power that is being met behind the meter, so not on the grid. And that's basically a reference to rooftop solar. And, as we've been discussing, the amount of rooftop solar in the system is now at such monumental levels, it's pushing that minimum demand to lower and lower and lower levels. The problem is we still need the grid. We need it to be there when the sun stops shining. And right now, the grid is being propped up still by coal and gas-fired power plants to a very significant extent. But of course, solar is increasingly squeezing these sorts of conventional power plants out of the system. And so more and more of them are closing.
Yeah, okay, but just explain that a bit further because that actually sounds like a good thing because aren't we meant to be reducing our reliance on coal and gas?
Yes, but what we're basically seeing at the moment is a mismatch between the system we're trying to build and the one we've already got, the one that we're using right now. I mean, this energy transition is basically a story about rebuilding the entire electricity system from one that runs on fossil fuels to one that runs on renewable energy. And right now, the old system is just struggling to cope with, those vast amounts of solar power that are flooding onto the grid daily. Now, that's generally true. There is that much solar washing through the grid every day, even through winter a lot of the time, that it's, almost invariably depressing wholesale prices in the middle of the day. But it's especially true in certain conditions. Think spring or autumn days when there's plenty of sunshine, output from solar is peaking, but demand for power is fairly subdued because the temperature is mild and people aren't using their air conditioners, which suck up an enormous amount of juice. In these circumstances, the demand for power from the grid, that is demand for power that is not being met by rooftop solar, it's falling to extraordinarily low levels.
Okay, so then what happens when that happens? Why does that matter?
Yeah, it's a question of physics, basically. Now, I was no, exemplary physics student at school.
I bet you were.
No, I most definitely wasn't.
I don't believe you.
But, the people who run the system, they understand these things thoroughly. And, running a power system isn't just about generating electricity to meet demand. That's obviously that's its most obvious purpose. It's also, though, about ensuring that, that electricity is provided at a consistent frequency and at a safe voltage so our appliances work properly and don't get cooked. The system needs this really steady heartbeat to keep everything on an even keel. To do this, the system relies on things like inertia, which is basically the physical property that makes balancing a moving bike much, much easier than balancing a stationary one. And the simple reason for that is, like the moving bicycle, these coal and gas and hydro plants are big pieces of spinning metal. They take a long time to get up and running, and they take a long time to slow down once they've got a head of steam. But this helps keep the grid stable. It helps it ride through shocks. And it's always been provided by these conventional power plants basically as a byproduct.
So coal and gas power stations provide stability, but renewables don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
The reality is that clean energy sources, wind, batteries, but particularly solar, they just don't intrinsically provide those services. They're connected to the grid by these bits of kit known as inverters that basically try to convert the electricity from the solar panels, for example, into a type that can be used in the grid. And they try to follow what's happening on the grid. And because the system, the grid that is almost invariably up and running and ticking along nicely, these solar panels through the inverters can just plug in and follow along. But for the most part, they don't, and they can't provide those sorts of system security services. They can't help maintain that heartbeat of the grid. I spoke with Alex Wannis, who is a former executive at the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO.
It basically becomes unstable, and you have to either increase the load during that time to make it more stable, or you have to basically reduce the solar output.
So Dan, let's look then at how we address this, because we want to use as much renewable energy as we can, right? We want to use as much sun as we can.
That's right, Sam. But we're really only getting into the teeth of the transition now. Alex Wannis says we're on the cusp of much better integrating all of this intermittent renewable energy. Starters, he says that inverter technology is actually getting much more sophisticated. By some accounts, there are now inverters that can provide a type of synthetic system security. And, there's a view that, these kinds of inverters will soon just become the norm, and so a lot of these problems might start to fall away. But then, of course, there's just something as simple as batteries. Alex Wannis reckons batteries will be able to take care of a lot of these problems for us because they'll be able to store so much of that excess solar power for use later in the day.
Batteries can also go even further. They can, with the latest technology, they can actually provide inertia so that it can basically pretend to be a coal or a gas plant and provide that inertia. And they can also provide something which the technical people call system strength. So that's really the ability to keep the electricity waveform really nice and smooth, which is also something that you want in an electricity system.
But importantly, there are other solutions that are out there. One of the biggest ones involves us as consumers, actually, Sam. We just have to change the way we use power. Historically, the supply of power has been there to meet demand. But increasingly, there's a view that demand should be much better at meeting supply. In other words, we should use as much of that renewable energy as we can while it's being generated. And for that, you can really read in the middle of the day when solar output is highest. Now, this doesn't mean we shouldn't use power outside of those times, of course. We can build storage to stash as much of that as possible away for later in the day, but storage costs money. We don't try to capture every drop of water that falls out of the sky in dams. It would be cost prohibitive. And the same sort of thinking applies to solar power. So finding clever and equitable ways of shifting demand seems to be the key.
All right. And that, of course, brings us back to Kerry, because she's someone who is really doing this well, isn't she?
I'm sure she feels that way.
Yes.
And, when I spoke to her, she certainly did feel that way. But, she's got in her house smart tech that can do a lot of this heavy lifting for her. For example, she's got software that can automatically turn off or on appliances or can cycle them up and down depending on the circumstances, how sunny it is, what time of the day it is, for example. More broadly, it could be as simple as a householder soaking up as much of their solar as they can during the middle of the day, pre-cooling their home in summer, pre-warming it in winter. The promise of this solution in particular, changing how we use energy is really enormous, but it's only if we can get it right. The jury is out at the moment, Sam, on whether we can do that. It's a bit of an open question.
Dan Mercer is the ABC's energy reporter based in WA. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed, Cara Jensen-McKinnon and Anna John. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.